Hello guys and welcome to the pre-built roundup. You know, good would be coming. After all, we just covered every single pre-built deck, so we are basically just going to go over each deck very quickly in a short amount of time, give them a nice score out of 10, and then compare them against every other deck as we go building that list. So hopefully you guys will enjoy it and we'll get into the first deck. So starting us off is a Forest, probably one of the weaker decks out of all of the pre-built decks so far, honestly. It's just really lacking any kind of a big win condition that it could use to possibly close out games, which makes it a fairly difficult one to use. While the early game can be pretty easy to secure, the late game becomes very difficult as soon as a big follower drops, as it just doesn't have the cards to deal with that. As far as value goes though, it is okay. The legendaries are an okay value. Insect Clawed is pretty decent still in nearly all meta decks, and Cora isn't exactly bad, but the golds really give this deck a little bit extra value, really pumping them up with pretty much all golds that are usable in the current meta, and pretty nice overall for Forest to have. It's just a little disappointing that compared to other pre-built decks, it's lacking in both sections a lot. It's just that the other pre-builts had a lot better value and a lot better playability overall, so we are giving the Forest deck a 4 out of 10 rating, which does put it at the bottom of the list. So while it's a little disappointing to start off with that, at least it gets the worst of the pre-builts out of the way. The next of the pre-built decks is Sword. Sword deck is actually probably one of the best or the better decks in this set, honestly. It's just got so much value in such a small package, running a lot of aggressive cards and still having some nice ways to go for win conditions, so either with just flooding board with small followers or just blocking out potential damage with some pretty decent spells and effects. Sky Commander Celia being a pretty big player in this, having a nice storm effect, along with Zeta being another one that can give you a storm effect. So both of those focus very heavily on storm. Dragon Knights as well has a nice storm combo as well. So overall, this is fitting really nicely with a more aggressive sword deck and is very close to a mid-range deck. Has extremely high value with nearly every card in the deck being worth it, minus maybe the couple of bronze cards which just aren't quite there, but everything else is worth having, especially if you are a sword player. So you really can't go wrong with this deck overall. It's just got that much value and playability to it, so we are giving this a 7.5 out of 10 for the Swordcraft, and that's a pretty respectable number to be pulling for a pre-built deck. And now Runecraft. Runecraft as a pre-built deck was pretty solid. It's still trying to probably do a little too much of two things, trying to add a kind of earth rune plus kind of spell boost rune, which honestly they don't work together exceptionally well, so that's a little disappointing that that's the way it decided to go. But for the most part, the value for this deck and the playability wasn't hampered too much. If you do focus on one of the two playstyles, usually you can do okay with the deck. If you are just looking for pure value though, it's running a lot of cards that Rune quite likes. Rooney is a nice one to have. Alma is actually coming pretty handy in Chimera decks, so that's also not a bad legendary to get. And of course the golds have some decent value as well, with Cagliostra, Grand Summoning, things like that, Absolute Zero Blade, all quite good cards and used in a variety of Rune decks. So if you are looking to play Rune in general, for the pre-built deck, this is actually still pretty worthwhile because it gives you a nice variety of cards for the Rune decks, which honestly there's at least 3 Rune decks that are still doing decent right now, with Earth Rune, Giant Chimera Rune, and Abyss Rune all doing very well in the current meta, and I can't see this losing too much value in the future. So Rune overall is going to get a 6 out of 10, not quite as good as Sword, but still really decent. And Dragoncraft as a pre-built deck is an extremely solid deck. Dragoncraft has both Zoe and Aizrahaka, which is pretty crazy, along with a lot of nice cards to go with that. The golds are pretty much all value. You can't really go wrong with the golds in this deck at all. Every single one is worthwhile to have, which does give this a slight edge to some of the other pre-built decks, and the playability actually works out really nicely. It can really secure itself, especially with 3 Canyon of Dragons, which is why I'm actually putting this deck reasonably high up on this list. It's actually going to be the second best deck out of every single pre-built, which is quite an impressive feat for Dragon. While I'm not a big Dragon player to start with, this deck really pushes that there. So if you are a Dragon player or you are just starting out, highly recommend getting this Dragon deck if you are buying the top pre-built already, which we'll get to right at the end, so you guys can enjoy that one. But honestly, just a crazy deck to use and really good. So we are giving it a 8 out of 10, which is a very respectable number to have, and for Dragon, a really solid one. So couldn't go wrong with this deck, honestly, if you choose to purchase it. The next deck up is Shadowcraft. I was honestly a little disappointed with this deck. The Underworld Asia is a nice touch for the value and for playability, but everything else seemed fairly lacking. Fairy just doesn't have the support to really work in this deck quite as well. You just can't keep your board stable enough that it could be useful, and by the time you can, it's usually too late. Aish is usually the better play overall for turn 10, so honestly I would normally stick with that. The golds don't have a super large amount of value and don't really add much to the playability. Shadow really just tries to do two things at once, trying to be Reanimate and a board flood deck, and really doesn't succeed at doing either really well. It could have just done with some better overall cards, which probably would have helped the deck, but I'm not really sure exactly what direction I would have taken to make this deck even better. It's only slightly above Forest because, you know, Forest had that iffy no finisher kind of issue where at least this has one. So Shadow is going to get a 4.5 out of 10, so slightly above Forest, but still probably one of the lowest pre-built decks to date so far. The next pre-built is Blood. We covered this fairly well, but I felt that Blood was still lacking a similar problem to most of the other pre-builts, and that was getting a defined finisher. So this one was a little better because it does have a reasonable amount of storm and ping damage and spell damage, which gives you at least a chance to beat your opponent down, but honestly, overall, not being able to get into Vengeance was one of the harder problems. They really should have had 3 Emeralda Blades. Would have done a lot better having 3 of those, as that would allow you to go into Vengeance a lot quicker and a lot easier than most of the other cards in this deck. It's definitely not one of the strongest decks, but at the same time not one of the weakest. It's definitely right in the middle. Its value is fairly decent. Vania and Vera are both good cards, and I can't fault them. The golds are okay, I just wish they were spread out a little bit differently, and everything else in the deck is a pretty stock standard to what Blood would want to use, so it's definitely not a bad deck, and that is why it's getting a 5 out of 10 overall, so definitely right in the middle of this kind of list. It's going to be sitting right there for you guys to look at. Now on to one of my favorite classes, Haven. It's definitely got some decent cards in its pre-built deck. Double Summit Temple works really nicely, although you don't have a Heavenly Knight to go with it, which is a little disappointing, but that still works out pretty well considering most of Haven's followers are pretty bulky. It's got a nice couple of legendaries. Beacon of Salvation and Gem Princess is both an amazing set of legendaries, which is why this gets put a little bit above Blood for the most part, because those legendaries just have a lot more value than the Blood ones overall. And the rest of the deck is actually pretty decent. Holy Lion Crystals do a nice job at really filling this deck out. It doesn't try to contrast itself too much. It kind of just does the one thing with healing your followers and making sure you have a constant board, which is really good. Being able to do those two things together works out quite nicely, and the golds have a lot of value with 3 White Fang Temples and some really nice Jeweled Priestesses, which all work out really well. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this pre-built, as this one is quite nice. It does get a 6 out of 10, so it is still below Sword, because Sword had a better playability and good value. This one is just below that because it hasn't got that playability there, but the value is definitely about the same as Sword, because all the cards are pretty usable and they're all really nice. So that's a really good one, and we've only got one left to go, so we are going to check that out right now. So the Portal pre-built, I really couldn't say enough nice things about this. Its value is absolutely insane, so we're going to start there. Its Biofabrication is an amazing gold. The Paraculus is an absolutely great gold, even at a 1 of, because it does give you options to build puppets and other decks later on. Hikarabe, great in artifacts, a 3 of, awesome. Saphira, that's your finisher in most artifact decks, so it's great to have those two right there. Then you have your legendaries, Desex Machina and Sylvia, both an extreme value pair, both for puppets and both for artifacts. You can't go wrong with Sylvia. Desex is more artifact based, but still an amazing card. All the bronze and silver cards in this deck are run in some version of Portalcraft, excluding Dimensional Cut and Jessica. Those are the only 2 bronze in this deck that I really don't like. But, I mean, when you've only got 2 bronze cards in the entire deck that aren't used in most decks, you know you have some value here, and that's totally worthwhile. And it's the exact reason we're giving this Portalcraft deck a 10 out of 10 overall. Just the value alone can drag it above pretty much every other pre-built, along with the fact that playing this deck is extremely consistent because everything in it is just that good. So that is really amazing for the last pre-built deck we have here. And to finish off this video, I'd just like to say thank you all for keeping up with all these. If you do want more in-depth look, I have covered every single pre-built individually as we were building up this list and getting everything ready for this big video. I really just wanted to cover them all, round them up, and have it all there for the future, because I think pre-builts need to be covered a bit more. There aren't a lot of YouTubers that do Shadowverse content, so having someone who can cover these sort of things is always fun. Even if the pre-builds don't make the best videos, at least they're there, so we have this history of Shadowverse. The pre-builds overall did fairly well. I was actually happy with most of them, with only really the bottom two being a little depressing for me because they weren't great decks and they really lacked a lot of the really good value cards. But overall, really happy with how this video turned out, and I hope you guys did enjoy it. If you did, hit that like button and subscribe. Check out some of my other content, and until next time, see ya.